I'm going to break the recordings of the theories of deviance out into separate lectures. I know that in the outline it says theories of deviance, but I'm actually going to create one lecture for each of the theories so that it's a little bit easier for you guys to keep track of and to be focused on. All right, so we're going to start with labeling theory, and then we'll proceed to the other theories a bit down the road. And this will be a little bit long because there are a lot of moving parts to labeling theory. It's a fairly robust theory. The general rule of thumb in the social sciences with regard to theory is a theory is considered good if it generates predictions that are then subsequently supported by observation or measurement or testing, right? So do we generate testable propositions, right, from a theory? That's the first thing we need to be able to do. And then are those testable propositions actually supported by the data when we go out and test them? And labeling theory has a lot of predictive power. It does a really, really good job, I think, of explaining a significant amount of human behavior around the phenomena of deviance, both in terms of how the deviant label emerges, but also how the deviant label sort of operates to impact human behavior and shape and organize social responses to behavior that falls, sort of within that constructed notion of deviance. And again, don't worry, we'll kind of get into what that means, and we can go over some examples in class. So if any of this stuff is not clear to you, as always, right, feel free to bring that up and ask questions in class. All right, so let's start with the labeling theory of deviance. This emerges through the work of a guy named Howard Becker, and then a number of other sociologists have kind of come along and worked in that tradition. The labeling theory of deviance essentially argues that powerful groups and people impose their notions of morality on others by defining certain acts or attributes as deviant. So remember, last time we talked about the social construction of deviance: expectation, violation, reaction. So one of the things that labeling theory points out is that deviance is essentially a label that gets applied to particular behaviors or particular characteristics, and the ability to do that, the ability to define certain acts or attributes as deviant and to then subsequently enforce that moralistic notion requires power. So this is one of those very interesting micro level social psychological theories that aligns quite nicely with one of the macro level paradigms like conflict theory, which looks all at how power operates within society and how power inequalities and competition that flow from those power inequalities kind of shapes the social landscape. So when we think about what behaviors or what characteristics become defined as deviant, you can see that there's an element of sort of social control there, right? That we'll get into the details of this, but it is in essence, in many regards, an attempt by powerful people to control groups of people by defining their actions and by defining their attributes as deviations from normative social expectations. There are four elements. There are four parts to this labeling theory of deviance. The first is what we call banning. The second is detection. The third is a process of attribution, and the final is the reaction element. And we're going to go through all of these, so don't worry if you are scratching your head a little bit and wondering what these things mean, because I'm going to go into each of them in a little bit of detail. The banning element in the social construction of deviance, according to labeling theory, is that process of defining a behavior or a condition as bad or wrong or immoral, And then, of course, associating those people who engage in those behaviors or who have those conditions as deviants, those people who need to be punished or controlled or in some way corrected. So banning is essentially the way in which a person's claim or a group's claim about what is proper or right or moral becomes established as the expectation, becomes established as the norm. That would align quite nicely with the expectation element that we talked about in the previous video. So that's what we mean by banning. Detection is essentially the discovery or the uncovery of violations of those expectations. So when we think about deviance occurring in the absence of any recognition that deviance has occurred, we see the importance of that recognition, that detection element of this, right? If I'm speeding on my way to campus, but I am not stopped by law enforcement, I'm not captured on a speed camera, right? Then for all intents and purposes, it didn't occur at a social level. I mean, it absolutely did occur, right? I exceeded the speed limit. But if my deviant behavior was not detected, and in fact, I would say, just to back up for a second, labeling theorists probably wouldn't even call it deviant behavior. They'd call it rule-breaking behavior, right? So if my rule-breaking behavior doesn't get detected, there really isn't any way for it sort of to rise to the level of deviance, because for it to rise to the level of deviance, there has to be a reaction. There can't be a reaction to something that was undetected. So that's why this is really, really important. And it gets us focusing a little bit on the structural factors in social space and in social environments that might make detection more or less likely to occur. So the physical design of a setting might be really integral to the detection of deviant behavior. We see this a lot, for example, in the process of criminalizing homeless behavior. Homeless people have to do all the things that everybody else has to do. For example, they have to urinate, they have to defecate, right? So those are just human functions. They have to sleep. But in the absence of a private dwelling, a private domicile, a place that gives them some privacy and discretion from the rest of the world, it's really hard for people to do those things in public and not be detected, right? That all of those things have to be done, but it is not legal to urinate in public. It's not legal to defecate in public. So the very fact that we have made those biological activities illegal automatically puts people who do not have housing at risk for falling into that category where their behavior is going to be defined as deviant. Right? Urinating is not deviant. Urinating in public is deviant, right? So that rule, that expectation that's in place now puts particular groups of people in a more vulnerable position to being labeled deviant for engaging in that behavior. So physically designing public space might make it really hard for homeless people to find a place to do that discreetly. Maybe there are no public restrooms. Maybe the sight lines from the street to the back of a community park or neighborhood area allows people to see all the way, to the back of a piece of property, which makes it very hard for a person, like a homeless person in that area, to engage in particular patterns of behavior without being seen. So that would be one structural feature. The presence of electronic detection devices, things like cameras, sound recorders, things like that would make it very difficult for people to avoid detection if they engage in deviant behavior. The placement of detecting personnel. This is why a lot of buildings have doormen. This is why schools sometimes have hall monitors, right? You put people in places where they are literally positioned to be able to detect deviant behavior. the presence of detecting experts in what we call gatekeeping positions. So caseworkers, for example, or parole officers might be in a position to, well, I shouldn't say parole officers, that probably fits into a separate category, but say, for example, caseworkers, intake workers. These are people who might be able to spot somebody who has engaged in some kind of deviant behavior, in their everyday life, and the fact that you have to kind of go through these individuals to gain access to something that you want makes it likely that, or more likely anyway, that previous acts of deviance that you've engaged in might then be detected. So, it doesn't have to necessarily be a physical human being. It could be a question on an application form, right? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Is a kind of filtering mechanism that is designed to detect previous acts of deviant behavior that would then render you ineligible, say, for example, for financial aid or something like that. So that would be another one of these structural factors. The parole officers and people like that would probably be more in line with the fifth element or factor, which would be significant levels of contact with what we might call the social control bureaucracy. So again, law enforcement's a really, really good example of this. If you have a lot of contact with police, if you have a lot of contact with people who are in a position to sort of screen you or observe you, or in some way increase your visibility relative to, say, other people, acts of deviant behavior that you may engage in or have engaged in are going to be much more likely to be picked up or spotted there. And then, of course, the sixth, the structural feature, is something I alluded to when I talked about physical design, which is limited access to private space. Part of the reason why poor people and people living in poor communities are more likely to be spotted engaging in deviant behavior is fewer areas of their community are sort of off limits to surveillance. Law enforcement has a much easier time surveilling poor communities because there are fewer places where the members of the community are able to maintain privacy. Or again, in the case of homeless people, limited access to a private space means all of the things that people normally do indoors that are legal when they are done indoors become subject to deviant labeling when they occur outdoors. So again, sleeping in public, urinating, defecating in public, having sex in public, all of those things which are perfectly legal to do inside a private space are not necessarily legal to do outside. And because people do those things as a function of being human organisms, those people who have limited access to private space are much more likely to be detected doing those things than people who have homes or places to sort of screen themselves off from the rest of the world. The other thing that kind of plays a role here in this particular stage or element in the construction of deviance is the occurrence of what we call primary deviance. So primary deviance is defined as the initial or sometimes isolated violations of rules or laws that almost everybody engages in. Again, this is what labeling theorists would call rule-breaking behaviors, right? So everybody engages in these things. But not all of our rule-breaking behavior is detected. Not all of our rule-breaking behavior rises to the level where it's noticed by social others, and that becomes kind of the crux of whether rule-breaking behavior rises to the level of deviance. If it doesn't get detected, then it doesn't, and if it does, it can. It doesn't necessarily always mean that it will, but it certainly means that the next step in this process can then be engaged. I can illustrate this actually with a really funny example from when I was a kid. When I was a kid in elementary school, I had a teacher my homeroom teacher, who decided for whatever reason that I was a trouble student. I was a bad student. And to be fair, I probably gave her some reason to come to this conclusion. I probably engaged in some act of primary deviance. Maybe I was talking in class. Maybe I came late. Maybe I was cutting some jokes with some friends in the back of the room. Whatever it was, right? This teacher got it in her head that that I was a bad student. So the thing that I did, whatever it was the act of primary deviance. The rule breaking behavior that gave this teacher an excuse to start looking at me in a particular way. And rather than sort of brush it off as, boys will be boys, or that's just a thing that kids that age do, she instead decided to assign responsibility for that behavior to me in a way that didn't allow for it to sort of just be dismissed or written off. That is what we call attribution, and that's the third element in this construction of deviance. So once that blame was assigned to me, once teachers, not just my homeroom teacher, but other teachers, began to see me this way, it led to a particular set of behaviors, right? So the teacher sees me as a bad student. Over time, other teachers begin to see me as a bad student as well, and the reason for that, of course, is that teachers talk to other teachers. So the teachers, who are not my homeroom teacher, over time are kind of primed now to recognize any of my rule-breaking behavior as indicative of a particular kind of student, right? That Gramlich is a bad student. And this becomes, in many ways, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Because what's happening here is that my master status is becoming that of a deviant. Now, no one calls me a deviant. They call me a bad student. But what happens is that identity, that status as a bad student becomes the lens through which people define, evaluate, and respond to my behavior, right? So if I come to class and I'm talking, or if I come to class and I'm passing a note to one of my classmates, or if I'm coming late to class, or I come to class with with no homework, or my homework doesn't, it's not done correctly, lots of wrong answers, nobody's surprised because I'm a bad student, and that's what bad students do. So if I come to class and I'm on my best behavior, if I come to class and I have my homework with me and all the answers are right, rather than changing the label, what happens is people fit the information to their preconceived assumptions, right? This is, again, we talked about schema and frames a little while back. This is another great example of the way in which people are engaging in a process of assimilation. They're going to fit the data to the already existing template that exists in their head, and the template that exists in their head is that Jim Gramlich's a bad student. So a bad student who brings homework to class on time with all correct answers is cheating, right? That's the only way that works, right? So the new information, here's Jim Gramlich, and he's got his homework and all the answers are correct. The new information doesn't get this person to change how they see me. It's shaped and molded to fit into what they already expect to find, right? So what happens then is, whether I do good things or bad things, they're both going to reinforce the bad student label. So after a while, I just start doing bad student things. Why not, right? Everything I do is going to, be filtered to that conclusion anyway. And being a bad student takes a lot less work than being a good student, and you get a lot of attention, all these things that kids love. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And self-fulfilling prophecies, again, are just situations in which the expectations and reactions of others lead people to act in a way that's consistent with the identity that's attributed to them. So this process of attribution becomes really, really important, because if the deviant act, or the rule-breaking behavior, right? If the act of primary deviance is attributed to a kind of enduring quality or tendency in this individual, it's going to become the thing that people see when they look at you. It's going to become your master status. And at that point, one of the ways that we, as people who engage in rule-breaking behavior that has been detected and has been attributed to us, it could manifest in the form of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And those have consequences, right? I mean, being a bad student isn't ultimately something that works out well for people. So what we do is we try to avoid, or we try to resist having these deviant labels applied to our behavior. And there are really two strategies for doing that. The first is something we call normalization. The second is something called neutralization, right? So normalization is where we try to avoid having the deviant label applied to us in the first place, right? So we are aware that we engage in rule-breaking behavior. We understand the consequence of that rule-breaking behavior is going to be a label that will become very problematic or difficult for us to work with. And so what we do is we engage in a strategy to try to appear normal. And there are three variations of that. The first is what we call passing. Now, passing is where you try to conceal your rule-breaking acts or your rule-breaking attributes by trying to maintain a conventional appearance. Years ago, before the cultural shifts of the late 20th and now the early 21st century, made same-sex sexual behavior much more tolerated in American society, people who were gay would often have to keep that hidden from coworkers, would have to keep that hidden from their bosses or their employers. And they did that by maintaining the appearance of heterosexuality. And the way you did that, of course, was, you would have a female friend who would be willing to sort of appear with you as somebody with whom you're in a relationship, right? You can't bring, office party. You can't bring your actual romantic interest to an office party because that would reveal to everybody that you are in fact gay. But if you bring this female friend with you and she agrees to sort of pretend like she's your romantic partner, you have the advantage of kind of maintaining an appearance of heterosexuality, right? You're passing as straight. The practice was so common, it was so well established that people actually call those women beards, right? And I like that kind of symbolic reference, because a beard, of course, is both something that covers something up, right? It obscures, what's underneath, but it's also a symbol of masculinity. So it kind of works on two levels. But that was an attempt that gay men, especially in the white collar world of executives, at a time of much greater homophobia and intolerance than maybe we're experiencing right now, they would work very, very hard to sort of pass as straight. Covering is a little bit different. Covering is when your stigma is known, right? People know that you have this discrediting characteristic. So you can't really hide it the way that you could if you were passing, right? In passing, of course, your stigma is unknown to social others. But in covering, people know that maybe they know you're gay. But what you try to do is distract attention from that particular aspect of your identity or your attribute by redirecting people's attention, right? So maybe you are a really aggressive and successful salesperson in this company, and somebody says to the boss, "Hey, did you know Gramlich is gay?" And the boss could come back and say, "Yeah, but he's beating all of you guys in sales. I wish all of you were gay," right? So what you're doing there is you're not sort of trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube. You're not trying to hide who you are, but rather you're trying to redirect people's attention. You're sort of covering up the thing about you that you don't really want them to see, that they're aware of. But if you can get them to focus on something else, then your you're much more likely to be seen as normal because people are going to be focusing on something other than the discrediting attribute or the discrediting behavior that you engage in. And then the third technique for normalization is what we call insulating. And insulating is where you avoid the labeling of your rule-breaking acts or attributes by restricting your interactions or restricting your ties to others. If you want to avoid, let's say you're an ex-con, right? You've been to prison, you're now out. Having that identity, having that label is very stigmatizing. You would love to be, you would love to avoid being judged on that characteristic, and so you spend most of your time with other ex-cons, right? All of these other people also share that discrediting characteristic. So by spending time with them, you're going to avoid being judged negatively for being an ex-con because they're all also ex-cons. In the piece that you guys are reading from Becker, right? The easiest way to avoid the negative label that comes with being a marijuana smoker, according to Becker, is to spend your time with other marijuana smokers. Right? People who will not see the behaviors that you engage in a way that is discrediting because they are also engaging in those behaviors. So that's normalization. Neutralization is a little bit different. Neutralization is a strategy in which you kind of accept that you are engaging in rule-breaking behavior, right? You're not trying to hide it. You're not trying to distract people from it. You're not trying to insulate yourself from the judgments that people have of it. Instead, what you're doing is you're trying to take the identity itself and try to transform it, right? That's an effort to sort of say, you are judging me for this behavior, or you are judging me because I have this attribute, but here's why you shouldn't be judging me according to that set of criteria. So there are 6 techniques that people use in neutralization. You don't really need to get into any great level of detail. I would like you to be broadly familiar with them, be able to recognize them. The first neutralization technique would be what we call denial of responsibility. This is where you make an external attribution. You say, I do this thing, but it's because these other external forces are kind of compelling me to do it, right? So I'm habitually late to class. It's not because I'm a bad student. It's because the local public transportation is not very reliable, right? So you avoid having your rule-breaking behavior result in a label of truancy or irresponsible student. The second neutralization technique is what we call denial of injury. So no harm was done, right? This is one that people will often invoke. Again, Becker's work in the 1950s and 1960s on marijuana users. Now, again, today with legalization or decriminalization of cannabis in a number of different places, this is a little less fresh, if you will. But nevertheless, you can kind of still see in the way that a lot of people who use cannabis would talk about the fact that it doesn't hurt anybody, right? It doesn't harm me. It doesn't harm other people, right? It's something that shouldn't result in any kind of meaningful social control reaction or the application of a deviant label, because there's really no harm that's being done by this. So that would be considered denial of injury. Denial of victim, which is the third technique in neutralization, is not to deny that harm was done, but that the person who got harmed deserved it, right? So we call this denial of victim. There's no victim here. This person who got hurt deserved to be hurt, or this person who is claiming some kind of harm sort of deserved the harm. And that's a little bit different. There is condemning the condemners, right? Who are you to judge, right? This is often one of those things that people do. Well, like, you do this other thing, and here you are calling me out for doing this thing. So, condemning the condemners is a technique to sort of try to neutralize attempts to label your behavior or your attributes as deviant. There are appeals to higher or other loyalties. So you might, you might resist the draft in a time of war, but you might do so by saying, that your religious beliefs require you to be a pacifist, to take a non-controversial, a non-combat sort of role in times of war. That would be an example of an appeal to a higher or other loyalty. You might say something like, yes, I let my parents down, but it was to help a friend, right? So, people would see the reaching out to help the friend as something that overrode whatever expectations your parents might have had of you that you had to violate, in order to help that friend. So those would be, again, appeals to higher or other loyalties. And then the sixth technique of neutralization is what we call claims of normality. That the acts that you are engaging in or the attributes that you possess are in fact normal, right? They're not deviant. And these could take any number of different forms. I'm thinking specifically of people who are talking about, say, for example, if they have a non-normative sexuality or they have a non-normative gender identity, they might make some argument that this is sort of who they are. This is their natural state. That's not an act of deviating from a social expectation. It's a conformity to who they are by birth or by circumstance. So again, I'm not going to ask you really, really in-depth questions about those techniques, but I think it's really good to have a broad familiarity with the six techniques of neutralization. So we've covered banning, we've covered visibility and detection, we've covered attribution. The only thing left now to sort of wrap this whole labeling theory up is reaction. See, we're already at half an hour. I'm glad I'm breaking this up into multiple videos because I knew this would take a while. So the last element is reaction. And reaction, of course, is on two levels, right? So there is our reaction to being labeled deviant, and then there is society's reaction to us as deviant individuals, or individuals who've been successfully labeled as deviant. So I'm going to talk about the objective effects, and I'm going to talk about the subjective effects of the successful application of this label. So you've been labeled by society, individuals, law enforcement, teachers, community leaders, whomever, right? You've been labeled as deviant. The objective effects of that include things that can be measured, right? The things that are going to have an impact on your work life, on your economic status, on your political opportunities, on your social relationships, on your community involvements. I mentioned before that people with felony convictions are often ineligible for financial aid. That would be a kind of an objective effect of having a label successfully applied to you. And the thing that makes those effects objective is that they're measurable. They're things that we can kind of point to and say, these are concrete examples of harm that were done to an individual, or these are empirically measurable consequences of people who have been successfully labeled as deviant. The subjective effects are the consequences that those labels have on our self-concept, right? So when we start to see ourselves as deviant, as we internalize that view of ourselves as deviant, that other people see us that way, and we come to start to see ourselves that way. Again, nice example of the looking glass self, if you guys are making those kinds of connections. But one of the subjective effects then is that if you internalize that view of yourself, you are much more likely to engage in those kinds of behaviors. Back to my example of being a bad student, right? When I realized that it didn't matter whether I did good things or bad things, that both of those behaviors were going to be taken as evidence that I was a bad student, I sort of just internalized that. I just started behaving like a bad student. And that creates what we call secondary deviance. Secondary deviance. Remember, primary deviance is the everyday incidental acts of rule-breaking behavior that everybody engages in. Secondary deviance is the deviance that people engage in as a response to being labeled as deviant, right? So, when we internalize that self-concept, when we start to see ourselves the way that society has come to see us through the lens of these various deviant labels, that's when we're experiencing the subjective consequences or the subjective effects of these labels. Now, I want to just very briefly sort of wrap that up by pointing out that when you think about deviance in the context of labeling theory, when you use this framework to sort of make sense of and understand deviance, one of the things you see is that social control is a recurring theme, right? So there are two ways that social control kind of operates here. The powerful groups of people who are imposing their notions of morality on everybody else by the creation of these, in essence, prohibited behaviors, right? Prohibited because if you engage in them, you're going to be labeled as deviant. That has the effect of giving society the right to impose controls on people who engage in those behaviors or who have those attributes. The other element of social control here is that most of us will try to avoid having those labels applied to us by not engaging in the behaviors that deviate from social expectations. So the consequence of this structure of labeling is that most people will actually conform to social expectations because they understand that these labels are consequential and they would really like to avoid having to deal with them. So what happens as a result of powerful people's ability to sort of create a set of moral expectations and behavioral expectations is that most people will try to find ways to conform their behavior to those expectations. And as I said, that's where, if you're looking, you can kind of see the social control element of deviance, which is, again, interesting because I think most people think of deviance as a thing that a person engages in that might have some consequence or impact on the broader social world. But labeling theory essentially says, no, deviance is a thing that society is doing to us, either labeling certain behaviors as deviant with the purpose of controlling the people who engage in them, or labeling certain behaviors as deviant with the purpose of getting people to not engage in those behaviors. So it's obviously, from that lens, it's obviously a mechanism of social control, something that society does to us, not something that we do to society. So again, I hope that was clear. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to bring them up in class or to raise them in the discussion boards. And so until the next time, I'll say goodbye.